Are you all set?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think we're all set. 11 in the morning.
I have to say, it's such an honor to have you here joining me today. I truly appreciate that you taking your time to be here today with me.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much. I have drafted some answers for you because some of them are a little bit complicated, but we can start with it.
No, take it as tómalo como una conversación de nosotros dos, ¿sí?
Sí, está bien, no hay problema.
Muy relajados. Before we commence this interview, I would like to talk about your childhood environment, okay? But I like to introduce you to the audience, despite you don't need an introduction, but I have to do it. So, Dr. Alberto Pérez-Gómez, you are such a distinguished leader in the field of theory of architecture and architecture. You are famous for your phenomenological approach to it. And throughout your very long career, you have written many books, powerful books about theory of architecture and architecture. Your latest book is Attunement, Architectural Meaning After the Crisis of Modern Science. You are currently in Canada, Quebec, where you teach in McGill University.
Well, I'm just retired from my full-time teaching, yes.
Yeah. Congratulations. Now you are free.
I'm a free agent, yes.
Yes. Okay. So I tell you, the main reason of these interviews is because I like to see what is, in the brain of the architect and how much the childhood environment could have impacted you, in the way you grasp the space now and you interconnect all these ideas and all these, you take all these philosophers and you study them and you bring them to architecture in times of meaningless architecture, unfortunately. So to start, where did you grow up?
Yes, in Mexico City, and I grew up there. I stayed there until I finished my architecture education I was about 23 when I left to go to England to do a master's and a PhD. But all my early life was in Mexico, and actually in Mexico City, which already when I was born was already a big city. So I'm completely urban. I have no experience with the countryside. I'm actually completely ignorant of plants and trees. It's very sad, but my life has been really urban.
Okay, that happened to many of us, and despite that, we love nature, right? I feel you look for it. How would you describe the house you grew up in?
Well, I was fortunate maybe because my father was an aeronautical engineer, and he was his school friends included architects and civil engineers. So I grew up in two different houses, but they were both really modern houses. I never grew up in a typical Mexican environment.
No, hacienda.
No, nothing like that.
That's
it would have been nice. I love them. But my father, since I was a kid, when I was 3 years old, he had his house designed by a friend. It was a modernist house, the people that, because where he went to school and where I later went to school was the El Instituto Politécnico Nacional de Mexico, which is was inspired by Mies van der Rohe and the Bauhaus. So it was very modernist, that was my education, for better or for worse. It was very modern.
Bauhaus, you cannot expect, from Germans, like very squarish and away from nature.
That's right.
And from the natural forms.
That's exactly.
That's interesting that, most of my interviews, and all of them I ask this question, and there is something in particular about all the people I have interviewed. They grew up in the rural areas, not you.
That's very interesting, you see.
And
for me, I would say that that my initial intuition was maybe to react a little bit against what I understood as a misunderstanding of modernism. because modernism can be amazing. I mean, you could say, I am convinced that that, for example, Mies van der Rohe did some very beautiful things. The problem, the problem, and very moving things. The problem is the imitation. That the kind of trivialization of modernism that becomes really very bad, like the cities we have.
Yeah.
That are really boring, like square, like everything is very bad. But I think that the fact that I had an engineer father was actually for me an incentive to think more about other values. I would say that's really what happened, and it happened to me mostly after I finished architecture school, because my own education was also driven by this kind of Bauhaus mentality.
Yeah.
But when I finished school, I felt that there was a real disconnect between what I was being taught and the values of the country. So when I became a little bit more mature and I started to think about these things, I realized how much was missing from my education, precisely because, just to give you an idea, I had a professor when I was it was a 5-year program in architecture, because it was, it was the old way. You went to school 5 years to become an architect. In 4th year, I had a professor that wanted us to make high-rise buildings for in a very rural town in Mexico, for people that always lived, basically they brought their animals to their house for heat, because it's a bit like Colombia, the altitude changes the weather, and there it's higher than Mexico City, this town, and the peasants usually brought their cows into the house for heat, right?
No.
So, I was absolutely disturbed by this project of doing low-rise modernist housing for this community, and I confronted the professor. I had a big problem with that. But it was that moment when I started to realize that architecture did not respond really to the values and the ways of life of the people, and that led me to try to look for more education where I could, study maybe these things, orient myself better, and that's where my academic life comes from. After I left my early architectural education, so that's. So I would say that my position was kind of reactive to my early.
I was going to say, you had this rebellious way of reacting to this. You didn't like it, so you try to change it in your own way.
Yes, I thought that this kind of modernism was not useful really for how I could practice like ethically and do justice to the values of the diversity of Mexican cultures. As you know, there are many different cultures that I mean, even when I was going up in Mexico City, I knew very little about that. The incredible richness of all the Aboriginal cultures in the country. It was kind of repressed, when I was growing up. It was, the line was that we all spoke Spanish, and it was one culture, and that's the culture of the Mexican modernity and the revolution, and, and it's completely silly, that. So I started to figure this out. The other option, by the way, which was the other way that my young colleagues could practice architecture, was the other extreme, you could say, a kind of formalism that was a kind of expressionist, like you work for a rich client and you basically make them a house that doesn't look like any other house. And that was the other value. And that, of course, also never convinced me. I thought that was completely stupid to think that architects could reduce their lives to serving rich clients.
Yeah.
I thought that the agenda really is to think about the common good. And so that's how I started thinking about these things.
You actually think that your culture, your childhood environment, in a negative way, maybe by pushing you, by making you rebellious, helped you to and lead you to this study of the intersection of human behavior and built environment. That's really good. So in the eyes of Alberto Pérez-Gómez, and the romantic word Stimmung, you know, the German word Stimmung. What does it mean for you?
Yeah, you're right. It's a word invented by romantic philosophers. Um, I think this is exactly what you were mentioning. This is really what I discuss in my last book, because I'm very interested in the interaction between architecture, mood, and atmosphere. And the German word for atmosphere is Stimmung. It's a word that is used, for example, by Peter Sumter, very well known. Uh, but which actually, if you speak German, it actually means mood. You know, like when you say mood in English, is something that we usually associate with something internal. Like when you are sad, you think it is your sadness, and it's only yours. Now, the interesting thing is that neuroscience, and I can talk a little bit more about that because that's what this is all about. Neuroscience has shown that these moods are never simply internal to your or my subjectivity. They are also and always external. And it's a real paradox. It's difficult to understand this problem. But this is where neuroscience stands, that they're neither exclusively internal nor exclusively external. They always appear in the interaction between our subjectivity and the environment.
This is what we call active cognition.
That's right. Exactly.
So it's like an activity.
That's right. So what one has to conclude from this is that for architecture to contribute to our psychosomatic health, to make us feel good, and eventually also to contribute to construct the ground for cultures in our multicultural world, it must first be emotionally resonant with human actions. Because the other thing that has become very clear, you know, people think about, you know, talk about it as, you know, emotional thinking, is that emotion is really at the roots of cognition. We cannot know anything without feeling first. We, particularly modernity, in the wake of Descartes, used to simplistically separate these things and imagine that feelings got in the way of clear thinking. But in fact, now we understand, I mean, there's someone like Damasio, this Portuguese neuroscientist that is incredibly brilliant. He wrote a book called Descartes' Error. He basically demonstrates how even when you look at the brain, it is not possible to have clear cognition without emotion. They are connected. So emotion is crucial. And you know, a lot of the arguments for modernism was that emotion didn't matter, that you had to solve things rationally, that's all you need to do as an interior designer or as an architect, has to do with the rationality of the situation. But in fact, we now know that the emotional dimension of the situation is primary for us to understand anything. So that already tells you something, right, about this problem. So emotion being the foundation of cognition, I argue that finding ways to design atmospheres for human events rather than designing novelty objects, you know, that merely demonstrate some geometric complexity that no one has ever seen before, or a simple technical sustainability is not enough. Like that the way to go forward in our discipline, whether you're dealing with interiors or you're dealing with architecture in general, is to understand that what you are doing is designing atmospheres for events. And I guess, you know, it's very fascinating to me because I think that is something that maybe interior designers generally have a better understanding than architects, because architects usually look at the building, you know, as a geometric object,
yeah.
right? So I think this is what I believe. This is what the book is about, right? That the issue is the design of atmosphere for events that, and in ways that acknowledge the importance of emotion.
Okay, I think I saw like in one of your seminars you were mentioning a book from Richard.
Richard Sennett, maybe?
Sennett. Yeah, Sennett. And you were saying that they used to build the spaces according to the role of the inhabitant of the space in society. So it makes a lot of sense, you know, if you're going to design something for someone, you need to bring out the emotion and to empower this role that the person has, so the person can thrive and the person can have a better life thanks to the design itself. So I was really happy to hear that from you when I saw your seminar, because it, you know, sometimes I have these intuitive ideas, but I don't know how to express them. But when I heard all your seminars from 1988 from Mexico, I try to, you know, to recall them all. And this was a very important part. So now, for example, on our next question, going back in time, okay? In this, there is any historical data of how people were affected by ancient spaces?
Well, yes, I'm not sure we call it data, because you understand data is a term that is used for experiment.
Yeah,
right?
in psychology, yeah.
And so experimental, the idea that you reduce experience to experiment is also a modern, it's also a modern invention.
Yeah.
You know, because you have to frame things out of life, and in doing so, in a way, you do violence to what you're observing. So I would not call it data, but there is certainly evidence. Yeah, of how people were affected by ancient spaces. For example, already in the first text that we have in the European tradition of architectural theory, which is a text written by this man you may have heard about, Vitruvius, yeah, in the time of Augustus Caesar, the beginning of the Roman Empire. Really, he lived between, you know, right around the age of the time of Christ, between a little bit BC to AD. Those are his dates. He wrote this text, and even there we find that he understands meaning, the meaning of architecture, as beauty and psychosomatic health being basically synonymous. So the meaning of the architecture would also be its beauty, and would also be the fact that it's healthy, that it contributes to psychosomatic health. It's not separate things. It's basically one thing. That's what we can gather from this text. So the very quest of architecture was really to make these places for well-being, you know, and well-being was also associated with beauty. Beauty, precisely in this sense, as something which appears self-evidently for the people. It's not something that is from the top down. It's something that basically comes from the bottom up, right? This understanding of something that is both good and beautiful. The associations of medicine, for example, and architectural theory were very common until early modernity in European theory. So it is clear that the values are integrated, and humans sought this kind of, if you could say, holistic attunement. Another interesting example that I can give you, and it's actually quite enigmatic, is when we try to understand the mysterious purpose of what, well, now specialists think is the very first ever temple that was built by our distant human ancestors in a place that is now in Turkey. It's called Göbekli Tepe in southeast Anatolia. We know from dating, this is actually something that was only found in the 1990s. Actually, nobody had excavated this site, so it's actually relatively recent find. We know that it was built around 9,500 BC, you know, which is really very, very ancient. If you think that that it's about 7,000 years before Stonehenge.
Wow.
So it's very ancient. It's the first ever temple. I wish I could show you a picture, because it has kind of a circular, it's a set of stones that make a circle. You know, you can Google it.
I think I saw it. Just to make sure, give me the name again, and we'll attach the link down for the audience to lead.
Yeah,
What's the name?
Göbekli Tepe. It's G-O with umlaut, with little dots. Okay. G-O-B-E-K-L-I hyphen T-E-P-E. It's the name of the place.
Okay, I will.
It's the name of the place in modern Turkish, of course. You know, it's yeah.
We'll try to.
Anyhow,
Yeah, it's fascinating because people, people always thought that we first built cities and we were first practical and hot, and then we built temples. But this actually is the opposite. Is the earliest thing ever that we have found made by people is actually a temple. And it's made by hunter-gatherers, the people that were actually nomads, right? That would always move. There were no cities. And these ancestors of ours, they were already Homo sapiens, of course. They had flourished for around 50,000 years in our planet. They had a very good life. They went around, they hunted, they gathered their food, and they lived perfectly good lives with good diets. People have looked at their bones, and they were very healthy, actually healthier than the earlier people, than the people that first founded cities, because agriculture changes the diet, and in fact, it becomes more difficult to have a healthy, balanced diet. But that's another story. So anyhow, it's very interesting because the temple, you could say, predates a little bit or starts to coincide with what anthropologists call the agricultural revolution, the beginning of sedentary life and the eventual development of cities. So it is as if somehow Homo sapiens, of course, I can only speculate on this, nobody really knows, but it is as if suddenly humans had become aware of something other that they needed, fundamentally important, obviously, for their psychosomatic health. Otherwise, they wouldn't have bothered, and somehow beyond this immediate continuity that they cultivated with the natural world that was always perceived as a kind of animistic living thing, and had always provided ample sustenance. So somehow you can imagine our ancestors decided collectively to accept a more difficult life, to build this huge thing where obviously thousands of these nomads from different bands had to cooperate over a long period of time to build this structure, and it really has this kind of cosmic resonance, as if something was absolutely necessary. So this is to me very interesting, that because it really tells you that as humans, and I don't believe in dogmatic religions, I think they are problematic, I don't go to church, but at the same time, I think humans need a kind of spiritual dimension, and architecture needs to be aware of this, right? It's beyond this question of the immediate material need. Wow. So that's something that I think, and that really connects to psychosomatic health. I think that's the kind of thing that Vitruvius talks about, and that most traditional architects recognize. That this order that architecture provides, yes, has a political purpose, can become nasty because it can be used by sovereigns to dominate people. It has all these dimensions that people always talk about, but most fundamentally, it obeys this need that we have as humans to make environments that speak to our spiritual needs, that make us whole. Exactly. And so that's what, So that's what I can tell you about that. That's what we see in history. This becomes, of course, less clear with the beginning of modernity, because people think that basically this is made up, that we don't need these kinds of things. That's right.
Yeah, this is true. Like, people think is made up to make money, or is unnecessary, or is luxury, which is not. That's why I wanted to ask you, had it ever crossed your mind that a design which is attuned to our psychosomatic well-being could have the ability to become a fundamental right?
Yeah, of course. Well, no, it has never crossed my mind, Nathalie. It's a very nice thought.
It crossed my mind. It did cross my mind because I did study law back in Colombia, and I never worked as a lawyer, but it crossed my mind because health is a fundamental right, okay?
That's right.
So anything that prevents our health to be damaged, it should be a fundamental right. So if the spaces can improve our health and not only prevent it, improve, because neuroscience is proven that you can recuperate your health. So it's not prevention, is to recover your health. So it should be a fundamental right. But yeah, it crossed my mind, and maybe I'm nuts, but I had to ask you this.
You are not nuts. I wish it would be nice, really. You know, I think it would really mean dismantling really some of the most fundamental values that drive techno-capitalistic ideology. You know, and that's a tall order, right? I mean, you know, it's because usually modern humans can understand material needs, but spiritual needs, you know, it gets very dicey, right? Because it can also be perverted. And I you know, I would hate that this become like something that drives the right, you know, to impose values on people by saying that, you know, we have to go back to church. It's not about that, right? So it's a very tricky problem, and I think it's a delicate thing to talk about. I mean, you know, a very nice philosopher, Gianni Vattimo, Italian man. He's I think younger than me. He's written some very good books. He talks about his concern about that. I mean, he's I think deep down he's very left wing, but he's also homosexual, and he's also religious. He tries to be religious, so he has a big dilemma, right? And he talks about these problems, and he basically concludes that what the best we can do is demystify the things that appear as absolutely unshakable, like the values of this techno-capitalistic ideology, to show that there are other ways to live, and that out of these cracks, maybe some of this understanding of our need for the spiritual could emerge, but certainly not impose anything from the top down, right? So it has to come from the culture, and it's a very tricky problem. But I agree that it should be our right to live in a healthy an environment that promotes our psychosomatic well-being. I mean, it's clear for those of us, I'm sure you have perceived it because you have traveled. For those of us that have that we've been fortunate enough to see different environments in the world, it's clear that if you are in an environment, usually an older town or city that has been created with care, basically even only the care of the craftsman that gets vested into the stones of something very ordinary, even that makes you feel much better, you know, and contributes to your well-being. Whereas a lot of the things that we build in modern cities are, of course, horrible, you know, like housing developments and stuff like that really, I'm sure, contribute to people's psychopathologies. So, of course, there should be something like that, but it would be very hard to legislate. Just like I would say it would be very hard to turn this conversation into something that you could instrumentalize from the side of psychology. You know, I don't think it's so easy. I don't think you can make it into a methodology. You can, of course.
Right. I agree. You know, it's not easy, and but yeah, I can always try to at least bring this information to people, because the more brains we think about it, I believe something different might come.
No, you're absolutely right.
Might come. Like, I have this South American inside me, you know, like you. I'm rebellious, and I think at the end, like, you are here and I'm here. At the end, I want to be there, fighting and getting something out of this.
Yes. No, I think it's very good. I'm very happy that young people like you feel certain sympathy for these things, because I've spent all my life fighting. You know, it's always hard.
Alone.
Like even in my professional career, I mean, you're right. I am kind of well known, and I was very successful I had a full-time position in a very good university, but within my school, the tendency is always towards the sciences, like architecture, these kinds of things I'm talking about. You know, of course, I talked in my courses, but I was really a minority.
like a minority of 1 or 1.5 with another very nice Colombian colleague, by the way, Ricardo Castro, who retired before me, was a very nice professor, very good friend of mine. But we were in the minority. The school now is all about sustainability, and it's fine, I mean, you have to talk about how to make wood more efficient and how to make walls that breathe and all these kinds of things. But it's not enough, I think we need to understand that architecture, particularly in the long, if you understand it with all its depth from the beginning of our humanity, the concern always was far more than this question of the efficient solution of some material necessity. So,
wow. No, you are so right. You are so right.
Thank you so much.
Like, it's inspiring to hear you, like sometimes I'm waiting to hear something like all what you are saying, and with this coherence that you have, because you have it in you for many, many years. You have thought about it a lot. So I do have all my respect for you. I'm so grateful that you share with me all this knowledge that's going to be shared with all your colleagues, the architects, and some psychologists that are interested.
It's a real pleasure, Nathalie. I wish you the best.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, you too. I hope the southern France is not so like troubled by the COVID situation. Take care of yourself, please.
It is troubled by the COVID. I hope it's gonna end soon. I hope, like you say, it's not a permanent thing.
So.
Yeah.